At first, nobody thought it would go this far. Power was changing hands, rules were tightening, but life still looked normal on the surface. Then suddenly, people started disappearing, and instead of hiding it, Benito Mussolini let everyone see what was happening. Punishments were put on display, and once that line was crossed, Italy lived under constant control and fear. It starts after World War I ended in 1918, when Italy was a broken country. Millions were dead or wounded. The economy was collapsing. Workers were striking. Many Italians felt like they'd been cheated, even though they were on the winning side. They called it a mutilated victory. This is where Benito Mussolini stepped in. Before this, Mussolini had been a socialist journalist, loud, aggressive, and always hungry for power. In 1919, he created a movement called the Fasci di Combattimento. It was small at first, but he had something others didn't. He knew how to use fear. His followers, known as the Black Shirts, didn't debate their enemies. They beat them. They burned offices. They hunted down socialists, trade union leaders, and anyone who opposed them. Police often looked the other way. By 1922, Mussolini had built enough power to pull off something bold. He organized the March on Rome. Thousands of his supporters moved toward the capital. The government panicked. Instead of stopping him, King Victor Emmanuel III handed Mussolini control. Just like that, Mussolini became prime minister. At first, he didn't rule like a dictator. He played it smart. He kept the system in place while slowly tightening his grip. But behind the scenes, violence never stopped. In fact, it got worse. And then in 1924, something happened that pushed Italy toward open terror. The man who shook Mussolini's entire system was Giacomo Matteotti. And he wasn't just some random critic shouting from the outside. He was a respected socialist deputy in parliament, known for being calm, precise, and fearless when it came to exposing corruption. In the spring of 1924, Italy had just gone through elections under a new law that basically guaranteed a huge majority to whoever got the most votes. And Mussolini's fascists used violence, threats, and intimidation to make sure they won. Matteotti stood up on May 30th, 1924, inside Parliament, and directly accused the regime of fraud, naming the beatings, the destroyed ballots, and the armed squads that controlled polling stations. Everyone in that room knew what he was doing was dangerous, because he wasn't just criticizing policy, he was exposing the entire system that kept Mussolini in power, right to his face. What happened next was quick and brutal. On June 10, 1924, Matteotti left his house in Rome and was forced into a car by a group of men. They were connected to fascist squads, including figures like Amerigo Dumini, a known thug with links to Mussolini's inner circle. Matteotti fought back inside that car, and evidence later showed he was stabbed during the struggle. His body wasn't found immediately, which made things worse because rumors spread everywhere. For weeks, Italy was tense, waiting for answers. And when his body was finally discovered on August 16th, buried in a shallow grave outside Rome, it confirmed everyone's worst fears. He'd been beaten, stabbed, and left like he meant nothing. The reaction across Italy was explosive. People were angry, shocked, and scared at the same time. Opposition politicians walked out of parliament in what became known as the Aventine Secession, hoping the king would step in and remove Mussolini. Newspapers outside fascist control pushed hard against the regime, and for a short time, it really looked like Mussolini might lose everything he had built since the March on Rome. Even inside his own circle, there was panic, because this wasn't just another act of violence in the streets. This was a political assassination that had gone too far and was now impossible to hide. But Mussolini didn't collapse under the pressure. Instead, he waited, he watched, and then struck back politically. On January 3, 1925, he gave a speech in Parliament that changed Italy forever. He didn't deny the violence. Instead, he took political responsibility in a way that sounded more like a threat than an apology. He made it clear that if force and brutality were necessary to maintain order and power, then that is exactly what would continue. That speech marked the exact point where everything shifted. Before this, Mussolini still pretended to operate within a legal system, even if it was heavily manipulated. After this, the mask dropped. Italy stopped being a country with a struggling democracy and became a full dictatorship in practice. After that, Mussolini moved fast and very deliberately, because he knew hesitation could give his enemies another chance. Within months, laws started coming in one after another, each one designed to remove a piece of freedom from Italian life. By the end of 1926, opposition political parties were completely banned, meaning there was no legal way to challenge the fascist party anymore. Independent newspapers were either shut down or taken over, and editors who refused to cooperate were replaced or arrested. Even talking openly against the government became dangerous. One of the most powerful tools he built during this time was the secret police system, later known as Ovra. While it became more formal in the following years, its roots were already forming in this period, and its purpose was to watch everyone, listen to everything, and crush any sign of resistance before it could grow. Informers were everywhere. A neighbor could report on a neighbor. Even a family member might turn on you if they felt it would protect them. Arrests became common, but what made it worse was the uncertainty. People didn't always know why someone was taken. Sometimes it was for writing something critical, sometimes for attending the wrong meeting, and sometimes just for being suspected of disloyalty. Thousands were sent to prison without fair trials, while others were exiled to remote islands like Lipari and Ustica, places far away from the mainland where they were cut off from society. At the same time, Mussolini understood something important about power. Silence alone wasn't enough to control a population. People needed to see what happened when someone stepped out of line. That's where the idea of turning repression into a public spectacle started to grow. Trials began to be staged in ways that made the accused look guilty before any evidence was even presented. Newspapers controlled by the regime would report these cases in dramatic ways, turning them into stories meant to scare the public rather than inform them. By the late 1920s, Mussolini had already crushed open opposition, but instead of feeling secure, he became more suspicious. This is something that shows up again and again in dictatorships. Once real enemies are gone, leaders start looking for hidden ones. In Mussolini's case, that meant turning against people who were once part of his own movement. Some early fascist leaders who had helped him rise to power began to lose influence or were pushed out completely if they showed even small signs of disagreement. Figures within the party who questioned decisions, especially around policy or strategy, were quietly sidelined or removed from positions of power. The military wasn't spared either. Officers who didn't fully support Mussolini's vision or who raised concerns about readiness and strategy found themselves reassigned, forced into retirement, or watched closely by authorities. What made this phase especially unsettling was how controlled and calculated it was. These weren't chaotic purges like sudden mass arrests with no pattern. They were targeted moves designed to remove anyone who might challenge authority in the future. Mussolini wasn't just reacting to threats. He was trying to prevent them before they even existed. This created an atmosphere where people started policing their own thoughts, constantly checking what they said and did. Public trials became an important part of this system. Special courts were set up to deal with political crimes, and these trials were often designed to reach a specific outcome. Charges were exaggerated, evidence was controlled, and the accused were presented as dangerous enemies of the state. The real goal wasn't to find the truth. It was to send a message. Over time, this created a kind of psychological pressure across the country. Italians began to understand that survival wasn't just about following the rules. It was about showing absolute loyalty at all times. As the 1930s began, Mussolini started seeing himself not just as a national leader, but as someone shaping history on a much bigger scale. He often talked about reviving the glory of ancient Rome, and this idea wasn't just propaganda, he genuinely believed it. That belief pushed him toward aggressive expansion, and in 1935, he ordered the invasion of Ethiopia, one of the few independent countries left in Africa at the time. The war was brutal from the start. Italian forces used modern weapons against a much less equipped army, and chemical weapons like mustard gas were deployed despite international rules against them. Villages were bombed, civilians were targeted, and the campaign caused massive suffering. The international reaction was strong, with organizations like the League of Nations condemning Italy and imposing sanctions. But inside the country, Mussolini used the war as a way to boost nationalism and tighten his grip on power. Anyone who spoke against the invasion was immediately labeled as unpatriotic, and that label could ruin a person's life. This period saw a noticeable increase in internal surveillance and investigations. Teachers, writers, journalists, and even ordinary workers found themselves under scrutiny if they didn't show enough enthusiasm for the regime. Loyalty became something that had to be constantly proven, whether through public support, participation in fascist organizations, or simply by avoiding any kind of criticism. The system that had been built in the 1920s was now being used more aggressively, reaching deeper into everyday life. At the same time, Mussolini's relationship with Adolf Hitler was growing stronger. At first, Mussolini had actually looked down on Hitler, seeing him as less experienced. But by the mid-1930s, that attitude changed. Germany's rapid rise and its bold actions started to influence Mussolini's thinking, especially when it came to control and repression. The alliance between the two regimes brought new ideas and new methods, many of them harsher and more extreme. By 1938, with those ideas, Mussolini's regime introduced a series of laws, known as the leggi razziali, or racial laws, targeting Jewish Italians. What makes this moment important is that Italy didn't always have this kind of open state-backed racism. For years, many Jewish Italians had been fully part of society. Some had even supported fascism in its early days. That's what made this shift so shocking. In September and November 1938, decrees were passed that stripped Jewish Italians of basic rights. Jewish teachers were removed from schools and universities almost overnight. Students were expelled. Government jobs were taken away. Jewish officers were pushed out of the military. Even marriages between Jews and non-Jews were banned. Businesses owned by Jewish families were targeted, restricted, or taken over. What made it even more disturbing was how public it all became. Lists of Jewish citizens were created and shared. People were officially labeled based on their background, often using detailed records going back generations. Newspapers controlled by the regime helped spread the message, turning neighbors into outsiders almost instantly. Children were separated from classmates. Families were isolated. Longtime friendships broke under pressure. This was a purge without mass shootings at this stage, but it still destroyed lives. People lost their careers, their homes, their sense of belonging. Many were forced to leave Italy if they could, while others stayed and lived under constant fear and humiliation. In June 1940, Mussolini made a decision that would push Italy into disaster. He joined World War II on the side of Nazi Germany, believing the war would be short and that he could grab easy victories while other countries were already weakened. But this was a huge miscalculation. Italy simply wasn't ready for a modern, large-scale war. The military lacked proper equipment, planning was weak, and leadership was often disconnected from reality. The problems showed up almost immediately. Italian forces struggled in North Africa against British troops. In October 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece, expecting a quick win. But instead, Greek forces pushed back hard, turning it into a humiliating failure. that required German intervention in 1941. These repeated setbacks made Mussolini look weak, not just internationally, but inside Italy as well. As the war dragged on, life for ordinary Italians became harder and harder. Food shortages became common, with rationing affecting basic items like bread, meat, and fuel. Cities were bombed by Allied forces, including heavy air raids on places like Milan, Naples, and Rome. Families lost homes, businesses were destroyed, and people started to question whether the war was worth it at all. The same propaganda that once made Mussolini look strong began to lose its effect because reality on the ground was too harsh to ignore. Once support starts slipping, dictators often react by tightening control. And that's exactly what Mussolini did. Surveillance increased, arrests became more frequent. Anyone accused of spreading doubt, criticizing the war, or lowering morale could be detained. Workers who protested poor conditions were punished. Soldiers who showed signs of defeatism were watched closely. But this time it wasn't working the same way. People were tired, hungry, and angry. Fear can control people for a long time. But when daily survival becomes a struggle, that fear starts to weaken. By 1943, the situation had become so bad that even members of Mussolini's own fascist leadership began to turn against him. They could see the war was being lost, and they knew staying tied to him could bring them down as well. This shift inside his own circle was something Mussolini had always tried to prevent through purges and control. But now it was happening anyway. And once the internal support started to break, his grip on power collapsed. The breaking point came in July 1943. After Allied forces invaded Sicily, the fascist Grand Council met and voted against Mussolini. This was the same system he had built, now turning on him. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested on July 25, 1943. Just like that, the man who had ruled Italy for over 2 decades was removed from power. For many Italians, it felt like the nightmare might finally be over. But it didn't end there. In September 1943, German forces carried out a daring rescue mission, known as the Gran Sasso Raid, freeing Mussolini from captivity. He was then placed in charge of a new state in northern Italy called the Italian Social Republic, often referred to as the Republic of Salo. This wasn't a real independent government. It was controlled by Nazi Germany, and Mussolini was now more a figurehead than a true leader. But that didn't make things less dangerous. In fact, it made them worse. This final phase of his rule was marked by open violence and desperation. The regime began hunting down anyone seen as an enemy, including resistance fighters, former political opponents, and even former fascists who had supported his removal. Militias and German forces worked together to arrest, torture, and execute suspects. Public executions became more common, often carried out in town squares or along roadsides to send a message. Bodies were sometimes left on display as warnings, showing exactly what happened to those who resisted. One of the most notorious examples of this brutality was the Verona trial in early 1944, where several former fascist leaders, including Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law, were executed for their role in the 1943 vote against him. This showed how far things had gone. Loyalty, family connections, and past support meant nothing anymore. If you were seen as a threat, you were removed. This was the purge at its most extreme level. There was no attempt to hide it or justify it with legal systems anymore. It was direct, visible, and violent. The country itself was also turning into a battlefield, with resistance groups fighting against fascist and German forces across northern Italy. Civilians were caught in the middle, facing reprisals, mass arrests, and executions. Mussolini's control during this time was weaker than ever, but the violence was stronger. It was the final attempt to hold on to power through fear, even as everything around him was collapsing. By April 1945, the war in Italy was reaching its final stage. Allied forces were pushing north, and German defenses were collapsing. The Italian Social Republic was falling apart, and Mussolini knew it. He had lost real control. His allies were retreating, and resistance fighters were taking over towns and cities. At this point, he made one last move to save himself. He tried to escape Italy by heading towards Switzerland. He disguised himself in a German uniform and joined a convoy of retreating German troops, hoping to slip through unnoticed. But on April 27, 1945, near the village of Dongo by Lake Como, Italian partisans stopped the convoy and began checking those inside. Mussolini was recognized despite the disguise. The man who had once controlled the country with fear was now captured without a fight. The next day, April 28, 1945, Mussolini and his companion Clara Petacci were executed by partisans. There was no long trial or formal process. After years of violence and repression, his end came quickly. But what happened after his death is what made it truly symbolic. On April 29th, his body was taken to Milan and displayed in Piazzale Loreto, a place where fascist forces had previously executed resistance fighters. His body, along with others, was hung upside down in a public square. Crowds gathered, and the reaction was intense. Some people stood and watched in silence, while others expressed anger built up over years of suffering. The scene was chaotic, emotional, and raw. In a strange and powerful way, this ending reflected everything Mussolini's regime had done. For years, he had used public punishment, fear, and humiliation as tools to control people. Now, those same elements were turned against him. His fall wasn't quiet or hidden. It was public, just like the system he had created.